Okay, so are you ready to dive into something fascinating?
Yeah, let's get into it.
Okay, it might be a little unsettling too, but we're going to be looking at War Making and State Making as Organized Crime by Charles Tilley.
Okay, interesting.
You heard that right. We're going to be looking at governments through the lens we usually use for, well, mobsters.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly not the typical way we think about it.
Not at all. And I know you love those aha moments
Yeah.
and those unexpected connections that, they make you see the world a bit differently. So get ready for this one because Tilley's work, it isn't just some
Right.
abstract theory. It has some really profound implications
Mm.
for how we view things like power, legitimacy, and just like the nature of the state itself.
Yeah, definitely.
So Tilley's central argument is essentially this. The process of how we build a state, historically speaking, has a lot in common with
Yeah.
a protection racket.
Okay.
And I know what you're thinking, right? You're thinking, that's a little extreme, isn't it?
A little bit, yeah.
But stay with me here for a second. Imagine a mobster, okay, approaching a shopkeeper and saying something like, nice little business you got here. Be a shame if something were to happen to it,
Yeah, classic.
Classic, right. So that's protection, right?
Yeah.
But what if we swap out that mobster for a king or a government? Suddenly we're talking about
Right.
taxes, armies, maintaining order.
Yeah, it's amazing how quickly it gets complicated.
Right.
Yeah.
So is Tilley saying that all governments are just like gangs with fancier titles?
Right.
No.
Not exactly. But he is, I think,
Okay.
pushing us to see how the line between what's legitimate and what's not when it comes to force can get really blurry
Yeah.
really fast.
It does make you think about history a little differently.
It's about, yeah, it really is. It's about questioning those categories that we just kind of take for granted, like governments, by definition. They hold a monopoly on force. They use it to defend their citizens,
Yeah.
but also to maintain order and to extract resources, which happens a lot through taxation. And Tilley's brilliance is that he's highlighting the parallels between these actions and those of, well, organized crime, which forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about, just the nature of power.
It really does. It really makes you look at history a little bit differently.
Yeah, absolutely. Just think about it. Throughout history, kings have sponsored pirates
Yeah.
only to turn around and offer protection from those same pirates.
Right.
For a price, of course.
Of course.
Local lords demanding tribute
Yeah.
from those under their control. And let's be honest, that's not that different from extortion.
No, it's not. And it's so easy to draw a line from those examples to the modern world. But the question Tilley is really asking us is, has anything really changed?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, over time, as armies became more professionalized, this use of force, it became more organized, more systematic, and, crucially, more legitimate in the eyes of the people. But the fundamental question is still there. What are citizens actually getting in exchange for surrendering some of their autonomy, for paying those taxes?
Right.
Is it really genuine protection? Or is it just another form of, and I love this phrase, protection rent?
Right. So we're being asked to think of protection as not something that's freely given, but as a part of a transaction.
Exactly.
Okay.
And like any transaction, it's worth asking, who benefits most?
Right, right. It's a really interesting way to think about it because we've been talking about this kind of forced transaction. But Tilley doesn't just draw on, this idea of organized crime to make his point. He brings in some compelling economic arguments, too.
Right.
He draws a lot on the work of economic historian Frederick Lane, who said that governments are essentially in the business of selling protection.
Okay, interesting.
So they have this ability to use force, or at least the threat of it.
The threat is almost as good.
Right.
Yeah.
To create a system that people are kind of compelled to participate in.
And that's where protection rent comes in.
Okay.
It's this term that Lane coined to describe that payment that individuals or businesses make, not just for the protection itself, but for the privilege of operating within the system, where those threats are, ideally, kept at bay.
So let's say you're a merchant back in like a medieval city.
Yeah.
And you've got bandits on the roads, pirates at sea, maybe even just rival merchants trying to undercut you. You're paying taxes to the local lord or king, not just for an army to fight off those threats, but for that entire system of law and order. That'll hopefully prevent them from even popping up in the first place.
Right. It's like paying for insurance.
Right.
But you don't really get to choose whether you participate or not.
Exactly. And the rulers, well, they're not just offering this protection out of the goodness of their hearts, right?
Well, of course not.
There's a profit motive here, which Lane called monopoly profit or tribute. And it's basically the difference between what it actually costs to provide that protection and what they can get from the people, from taxes.
Right.
To make it even more clear, imagine like a labor racketeer,
Right.
like the stereotypical union boss who demands payment from businesses to protect them from strikes.
I see what you're doing there.
Yeah. So the business owner, they get some peace of mind.
Mm-hmm.
The union boss gets their cut.
Right.
And the workers, well, they're part of this system whether they like it or not.
Yeah, they're kind of along for the ride.
So we've got protection rackets, monopoly profits, the system where everyone's kind of stuck
That's common.
in this web of dependence and coercion. Yeah, it's fascinating. But what I find really interesting is how this whole relationship, this balance of power between the rulers and the ruled, has kind of shifted throughout history, you know? And this is where Lane's work is really interesting because he identifies these distinct stages in the history of capitalism.
Interesting. He outlines 4 stages, and each one reflects a different dynamic between, those in power and those who are subject to that power. So in those early stages, it's really all about brute force. Think anarchy, strong men grabbing whatever they can.
Right.
There's not a lot of incentive for things like long-term investment or economic growth.
Right.
But as these rulers start to consolidate their power a little bit more, and they create these more stable states, something really interesting happens.
What's that?
The people who really benefit from that stability, primarily merchants and landowners, they start to gain more from that protection rent than the rulers are getting from their tribute.
So there's this tipping point where the ruled, or at least some of them, start to get a little bit more leverage.
Exactly. This shift, which Lane identifies as happening around the 1600s, is really crucial because it marks the start of when we see things like property rights start to emerge. The way we understand them today anyway. Like, if I'm a merchant and I stand to gain more from a predictable, stable system than what I'm losing in taxes, I'm suddenly very invested in making sure that that system sticks around.
Right.
I'm going to demand a say in how things are run. I'm going to push for policies that benefit me and my interests. And this is where historian John DeVries's idea of a symbiotic relationship comes in between the state, military power, and the economy.
Okay, can you unpack that a bit? Symbiotic relationship, it sounds a little cozy when we're talking about war and extraction.
Right, it does. But DeVries argues that war, ironically, became a driver not just of state expansion, but also of economic development.
Okay.
Think about it. War needs resources. It needs organization, innovation. It forces states to find more and more efficient ways to extract resources, which can, in turn, lead to the development of new technologies and industries.
So it's like this strange feedback loop. War drives economic development, which gives you the resources to have more war.
Exactly. And this all feeds into this state-making process. It leads to those complex systems of governance and bureaucracy that we see today.
But all of this comes at a cost.
Of course.
And I think that's a perfect way to transition into the next part of Tilley's argument, which is about this real cost of power and how it shaped the different states that emerged throughout history.
Yeah, and that cost, it wasn't just theoretical, was it?
Not at all.
So we've been talking about the cost of war, the cost of protection, but for the states themselves, what did that cost actually look like? And what does it tell us about how they evolved?
Well, that's where Tilley's framework really helps us understand things, because he argues that it's the cost of these key activities: war-making, state-making, protection, extraction. That's what really shaped the different types of states that emerged throughout history.
So it's not just about if states do these things, but how much they have to invest in them, how much they have to, squeeze out of their population to survive.
Yeah, exactly. Think of a small state like Brandenburg, Prussia. They were constantly surrounded by powerful rivals.
To survive, they had to pour a ton of their resources into building a really strong military, even if it meant having heavy taxes and a really, really structured society.
So their high cost of doing business forced them to become this really militarized, centralized state.
Exactly. They had to create a powerful military.
Yeah.
And they needed the bureaucratic system to support it, just to survive.
Wow.
Now compare that with England. They're an island nation, And they've got this booming commercial economy.
Right.
They still went to war, of course.
Right.
But being an island, they didn't have to dedicate as many resources
Hey, it's just
to defense.
they could, I don't know, they could get away with being a little more hands-off
Yeah.
when it came to things like taxation and just state control in general.
In a way, yeah. I mean, they still needed a way to collect taxes, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't have to be as big or intrusive as you might find in a place like Brandenburg, Prussia.
That's fascinating how Tilly gives us this way to compare these really different historical trajectories. We can see how the cards they were dealt, so to speak, the challenges they faced, push them down these different paths of development.
And it's not just ancient history either.
Right.
Think about today.
Yeah.
The incredible diversity of states we have in the world. Tilly's framework helps us understand how those differences came to be, how the cost of war and state-making has shaped, well, everything from their internal structures to their relationships with their own citizens.
So we've been focusing so far on, the internal dynamics of states, the relationship between the rulers and the ruled, the cost of protection, extraction, all of that. But states, they don't exist in a vacuum, do they?
That's right.
What about competition between states?
That's a huge part of all of this. Just like that local lord, remember, who was expanding his territory by fighting his rivals.
Right.
States are always competing for power, for influence, on a global scale.
Right.
George Medelsky, he's a scholar who actually built on Tilly's work. And he argued that this very idea of the nation-state, the way we understand it today, came from this constant struggle for power.
It's like, I don't know, a giant game of Risk, but with real consequences.
Yeah.
Playing out over centuries.
Exactly. When one state starts throwing its weight around,
Yeah.
conquering stuff, building up its military, other states, they're forced to respond, right?
Yeah.
Either they step up their game or they risk being left behind.
So this international competition, this pressure cooker environment, it forces states to become more efficient,
Right.
more ruthless
It can, yeah.
in how they go about getting power.
It's not even just about military force either. Alliances, treaties, which you'd think are about cooperation.
Right.
They also shape how states change over time. If a state needs a powerful ally to survive, they might be more likely to have a large military, even in peacetime.
It's like this constant balancing act,
Right.
trying to keep things stable at home while also navigating all of the stuff going on between states.
And Tilly points something out that's really important. There's a difference between the development of older European states and newer states, especially the ones that came out of colonization.
So you're saying there's a difference in how they came to power?
Exactly. Many newer states, Tilly says, basically copied military structures from their old colonial rulers, often without those checks and balances that developed over time in Europe.
So they end up with these powerful militaries, but they're not necessarily accountable to their citizens in the same way.
Exactly. And that obviously has huge implications for things like democracy, human rights, economic development even. It's a lot to think about, but it really gets to the core of what Tilly is saying when he compares state-making to organized crime.
So where does this leave us? I mean, we've covered so much. We've explored some really uncomfortable things about how states operate. What are we supposed to do with all of this?
It's a great question. And honestly, it's one Tilly doesn't answer for us. He gives us this framework, right? This incredible framework for understanding how states came to be, how they work. But we have to decide what to do with that knowledge.
So it's about being more aware, more critical
Yes.
of the forces that have shaped our world.
Exactly. Tilly wants us to ask those tough questions, like who's really benefiting from all of this? What are the true costs? And how can we, as citizens, make sure our governments are actually serving us, that they're not just stuck in this cycle of taking and controlling everything?
It's a lot to think about, but definitely important for anyone who wants to understand the world we live in today. And on that note, we'll let you continue your deep dive into this fascinating and sometimes unsettling world of politics and power. See you next time.